Following the relocation of the indigenous tribes of the West onto reservations in the 1870s, an influx of homesteaders and ranchers moved to Wyoming, all of them competing for land and water rights. Homesteaders, usually controlling no more than 160 acres for a small farm, were pitted against large-scale cattle ranches with hundreds of thousands of acres in their control. This fight perhaps peaked with the so-called Johnson County War in the early 1890s, but there is a no more heartbreaking story than that of Ellen Watson, a homesteader more commonly known of as Cattle Kate. I'm standing a couple miles west of Pathfinder Reservoir and a couple miles east of Independence Rock. Independence Rock, of course, is famous. It was a major waypoint on the Immigrant Trail, and the Immigrant Trail passed down here through the Sweetwater Valley. And of course, we also know that Pathfinder Reservoir is named for the Pathfinder, John Fremont, who did so much exploring in the West in the 1840s. But neither of those historical points are why I am here. I came to this very spot next to this limber pine tree because this is the place where in the summer of 1889, Miss Ellen Watson was murdered. Prior to the existence of land agencies like the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service, the United States federal government referred to the land it had in the West as open range. Large cattle operations often let their animals graze and take water from open range without paying for that use. For a nominal fee, an individual could file a claim of request for the land as a homestead, getting roughly 160 acres to develop as best they could. If they could stay on it for 5 years, it was their farm. Ellen Watson, hailing from Nebraska, moved to Wyoming and purchased a homestead about a mile to the east of here in 1888. Her boyfriend, Jim Averill, he had purchased a piece of land that bordered that homestead just a couple years beforehand. It was excellent land for raising cattle on because both the Sweetwater River and Dry Creek ran through it. They could grow hay, grow produce, cattle could wander around. Unfortunately for them, a local rancher named John Bothwell had been using the open range out here for years. And he was none too happy to see a couple of homesteaders move in and start using land that he deemed his for his cattle. John Bothwell was a member of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, the WSGA, an organization made up of the largest cattle barons with the strongest political ties in the territory. They controlled the rights to brands for ranches, held sway over stray cattle and water rights, and essentially ran the territorial legislature. The WSGA spoke for the absolute largest businesses in Wyoming, and with far fewer laws than we have on such things today, they virtually controlled the territory. For that reason, small farms had little chance of survival if the Stock Growers Association turned sour on them. When Ellen purchased 22 cattle and began putting in a irrigation ditch out here to draw water off the Sweetwater, Bothwell and a few of his friends decided they just had enough of these homesteaders. So John Bothwell came over and confronted Ellen about the land and about her use of it, about his history on it. But of course, the law was not on his side. Ellen and her boyfriend had right to this land under the Homestead Act. So there was nothing that Bothwell could do about it. Thus, he began spreading bad rumors about her. Maybe that would drive her out. He said she was a prostitute that was just trading favors for cattle, even though the 22 cattle she had bought, there was a receipt for them in Rawlins. I believe it's still there to this day. The prostitute thing didn't stick real well, so then Bothwell began saying she had just stolen the cattle. They had been stolen from some ranch that he wasn't sure of. Of course, no rancher ever came forward to claim that they were his cattle because the cattle had been legitimately purchased. On July 21st of 1889, Ellen went to meet some Eastern Shoshone who were trading in the area, from whom she bought a pair of beaded moccasins. She came back to the homestead only to find Bothwell and his men tearing apart the corrals and chasing off the livestock. She confronted the men, and they tied her up and threw her in a wagon. A young boy from a nearby farm, Gene Crowder, had come to visit Ellen that day, and he saw the abduction, so he ran home to report it to his parents. Bothwell and his men then went to Jim Averill's general store, tied him up, and threw him in the wagon with Ellen. They took the Homesteaders to a stand of trees overlooking the farm, where Ellen Watson and Jim Averill were hung and left to swing in the wind. A local farmer, Frank Buchanan, rode up on the lynching and attempted to intervene. Gunfire drove him away. When they were cut down later that day, the new moccasins were found under Ellen's bare feet. So there were witnesses to the crime, and charges were filed. However, 5 of the 6 men who were involved were members of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, the most powerful organization in the state. And there was a reluctance for anyone to come forward with information against people who were members of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. Young Gene Crowder agreed to testify, but then he disappeared. His body was never found, and it's presumed he's buried out here someplace. After that, Frank Buchanan, who had been shot at trying to get to the scene, said he would testify. But then he got shot at a bunch of times while on his own farm by unknown gunmen. And he just said, you know what? I'm not going to deal with this anymore. He packed up and left the territory. That would seem like it was the end of it, but then it went to another level. And that's where the term cattle Kate came into play in the press. Newspapers owned by members of the WSGA in Cheyenne and Laramie quickly ran articles on Ellen, claiming her real name was Kate Maxwell and hinting that Jim Averill was an escaped murderer. The Eastern press picked up on the salacious stories and began to refer to Ellen Watson as Cattle Kate, the fine-looking female cattle rustler from Wyoming. At best, these rumors were hearsay and had nothing to do with the crime, and at worst it was felonious slander. But it sold well in newspapers, so Ellen Watson, a hard-working conservative homesteader, was posthumously derided as Cattle Kate, the prostitute cattle rustler. It would be many years before investigative reporters revealed the truth of who she really was, and John Bothwell would never be punished for his crimes. In fact, the Averill and Watson homesteads were auctioned off and bought by members of the WSGA. Bothwell got away with it. The story of so-called Cattle Kate is one of the most famous of numerous tales that pit large-scale cattle barons against the small-scale homesteaders. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association ruled Wyoming at the time of this event, and it would take an even bigger mishap, that being the Johnson County War up near Buffalo, to bring them into line. For what it's worth, the WSGA is now a completely reformed organization that represents all stock growers in the state. But sadly, that didn't happen until long after Ellen Watson, a seemingly honest homesteader, was murdered and had her name smeared into history as Cattle Kate.